CEE,
Central Europe Explained,
an IDM podcast series
powered by Erste Group.
Episode 56, Hungary and the European Union Presidency. Today is a particularly unusual time in global politics, not just within Europe, but worldwide. Many countries have gone through elections and government shifts where far-right parties have taken the lead. The results of Austria elections a few weeks ago are a clear example of this trend. And since 2010, Hungary has also been governed by the controversial Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. Orbán has sparked ongoing debates within the European Union due to his conservative policies, which have even led Ursula von der Leyen to accuse him of steering Hungary in a direction contrary to the EU values. From July the 1st to December 31st, 2024, Hungary is leading one of the EU's most important institutions. However, this presidency has sparked controversy across Europe, and we wanted to find out how people in our community feel about it. Welcome to Central Europe Explained. I'm Gloria Becerril, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing Hungary's current presidency of the Council of the EU. To guide us through this topic, I'm joined by our expert on Hungarian and EU affairs, Techet, research associate at the IDM. Together, we will explore how Hungary's potential context might shape this presidency and what impact it could have on the EU's decision. So, welcome, Peta, and thank you for joining us today.
Welcome, Gloria, and thanks for having me.
And before we dive into the main discussion, I would like to start with a quick, fun exercise to get us into the topic. I'm going to say two words or concepts, and I would love to hear the first thing that comes to your mind when you connect them. How does that sound?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's start. Left wing and European Union.
So the European Union as a social union, perhaps a nice but rather unrealistic goal.
Okay. Right wing and European Union.
The EU, so the European integration, was originally an idea of Catholic conservative politicians like Robert Schuman or Alcide de Gasperi. To achieve this, they had to overcome their nationalism. However, today many right-wing parties in Europe are nationalist.
Democracy and European Union.
Interesting debate. Where is the right place for democracy, the nation state or the supranational level?
Hungary and European Union.
Hungary gets a lot of money from the EU, so unfortunately, the EU is funding an authoritarian regime.
Okay, thank you very much, Peta. I think we're ready to start and fully dive into our topic. What do you think?
Yes, we can do it.
For this episode, we wanted to get a sense of how the public views Hungary's presidency. So we went out to the streets and asked people three questions. First, we asked if they had heard about Hungary's presidency of the Council of the EU and what their opinion was. Let's listen to their answers.
I'm personally not a fan of him as a politician, but I think it's an important part of the democratic process that he does these 6 months, even though he might enact some policies that are not really in line with EU values and norms.
So I don't know. I think years ago Austria had the already nearly far-right government, and there was a strong reaction of the EU against it. But I still hope that the politics of the entire EU may influence also Hungary during the presidency.
Yeah, I think it's maybe a little bit weird because I think like this you should like enforce maybe that Hungary would follow the EU like values. Now I hear about this, I think it's a little bit weird. They should be like more strict.
In my opinion, Western countries don't want to allow Hungary to have a much say in Europe. They are not yet rich enough to have any real influence in Europe. And it won't be easy for a long time yet. Hungary has how many inhabitants? 10 million? Or even less? So it's like Austria. What is that? You can't tell a country with 190 million inhabitants, like Germany, for example, what to do. France also only has about 70 million. Italy, Spain. These countries have been in Europe for a long time. They don't let Hungary dictate anything to them. In Hungary, they can say what they like, but in Western Europe, they don't take it seriously. That's my opinion. They simply don't have a say there.
Well, I do not know explicitly which powers, how they share the powers. I only know that there are different responsibilities, maybe also in terms of representation. There are certain specific responsibilities, and the fact that Hungary takes a position now is certainly maybe a bit disquieting for me, in the sense that I do not agree with the politics that have been led by Orbán over the last years.
To be honest, I have no idea, so I'm sorry. I don't really watch the news. Most of the time I don't have time. I'm kind of my own bubble. I don't know about the outside world, so yeah.
Petra, was there any answer that might have caught your attention?
It's not really surprising, but still sad how little the people know about the European Union and how little they are interested in it. The EU institutions are complicated, of course, but what surprised me was the widespread lack of interest, of course, and hopefully our small survey was not representative.
Yeah, hopefully. And for those who might not be familiar with how the European Union operates, could you maybe explain what it means for a country to hold the presidency of the Council of the EU and how this role fits into the larger workings of the European Union?
The presidency means that the member state holds the chairmanship of the Council of the European Union. It means the Council of Ministers. The Council of the European Union meets in various configurations depending on the topics to be addressed. In this negotiation, the relevant minister, so from the country holding the presidency, chairs the meeting. Therefore, the Council presidency cannot be personified or tied to a specific person or office, such as the head of the state or prime minister. I also had the chance to talk about the topic with Professor László Andor, a Hungarian economist and former EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. He is now Secretary General of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, so the think tank of the European Socialist Party. I asked him how he perceived the current situation, how the scenario is different from 2011 when Hungary held the EU Council presidency for the first time.
Well, I can compare it easily to 2011. I think the expectations have been completely different because in 2011, Hungary was just another new member state. There was a lot of positivity and not too much concerns. It was assumed that the Hungarian diplomacy on which the Council presidency rests is experienced. And I think this also became true. And now I think it's quite well known that the Hungarian presidency was dreaded by many EU officials, civil society, activists, experts, because in the meantime, Hungary became a special case of an autocratic deformation of the political system and a case study in Euroscepticism, and obviously there have been many who feared that this phenomenon would impact heavily on the the Council presidency. And I think now, halfway through the process, we can say that this became true.
With Hungary leading the Council, a lot of people are wondering about the influence it might have. Can you explain why Hungary's presidency is causing so much debate right now?
Hungary last held the EU Council presidency in the first half of 2011, and that time Viktor Orbán's government was relatively new, having been in power for less than a year. Since then, much has changed in Hungary, as well as in the relationship between Hungary and the European Union. So the current Hungarian EU Council presidency has therefore faced criticism even before it began, particularly in the European Parliament. However, these criticisms were less related to the official goals of the presidency and more connected to the authoritarian policies of the government in Budapest or Viktor Orbán's controversial so-called peace missions in Moscow or Beijing in the summer. However, Hungary has the presidency during a transitional period when the outgoing commission is still in office, but a new commission has already been proposed and is expected to be elected soon.
We asked people if they thought Hungary and Orbán's ideology could negatively influence EU's decision during the presidency. And here's what people had to say.
Not really fears, but negative expectations. I think Hungary can influence Europe, especially in combination with the votes in Austria now. I think that's a bit complex now.
It's always a worry. The problem with the EU presidency is always one of transparency, I think, because a lot of EU citizens aren't really fully aware of the powers that can actually be enacted. So I think generally in forms of a symbolic gesture, that's probably the bigger impact than any policies that are actually enabled overall. It's starting to give kind of a bad picture. I mean, with the elections here in Austria last week and the tendencies in Northern Europe and also in the Netherlands, it's starting to move in a direction that is more, let's say, conservative, some people might call it, and it's just dangerous because it's going in a direction like in the United States where people are using legitimate democratic offices and processes to enact policies to erode that entire system. So I think exclusion is bad, but yeah, there's a real danger that there's a huge step backwards being taken by this presidency.
They will try, but we live all the time like this. So I live with these mechanisms that I have hope over fear while I live.
Hungary is a neighboring country to Austria, so many know who Viktor Orbán is. Unfortunately, they do not know much about what he's doing in Hungary or whether it could serve as a warning to other countries. I asked Professor Andor if he thought holding the presidency of the European Union Council was a mere administrative role or if there was an actual danger that Hungary could influence negatively on the European Union during these months. This is what he said.
Well, number one, I think it just impacted on the atmosphere around the Council presidency that Mr. Orbán, the Prime Minister, basically hijacked the visibility and the limelight which comes with the opportunity to hold the Council presidency and started with this so-called peace mission, which in reality was a very controversial tour to state leaders. Very few suspected when he visited President Zelensky that he would follow up with Putin and Xi Jinping and ending the tour with Donald Trump. And I think on the one hand, it is true that a lot of people would want to see the end of the war in Ukraine after more than 2 years and a half. And nevertheless, I think it's also understood that the European Union would need to remain united, and breaking ranks on such important matters, of course, is not good for the image and the reputation of the European Union, which the Council presidency would also need to safeguard. I think holding the Council presidency is more than just an administrative responsibility. We often use this expression to be an honest broker, and that indeed demands a capacity to broker deals, agreements honestly. And this capacity is what is doubted when Hungary, the current government of Hungary, comes into the discussion. And sadly, in the recent plenary in Strasbourg, this was on full display. I think let's not question this point. The Prime Minister, Mr. Orbán, was raising several issues which otherwise would be a very important part of the discussion. Economic competitiveness or demography, for example. I think these would deserve a serious discussion. Nevertheless, because he lacks authority. He is on many issues sidelined or ostracized. He lacks the capacity to be the honest broker and to lead a constructive debate with the European partners on these matters.
Okay, so we could say that the country holding the presidency of the EU Council has a louder voice when it comes to important decisions regarding the EU, right?
Yes, the EU presidency is not just an administrative task. The country holding it can set the policy agenda for the EU. Professor Andor also mentioned some examples from the program of the Hungarian presidency, such as competitiveness. This is, of course, an important issue for the EU, but Orbán is only interested in promoting his own agenda in the area of competitiveness, as Professor Andor also stated.
I was present in a meeting of the permanent representative of Hungary in Brussels when he outlined the program of the Hungarian presidency. And indeed, he pointed to some of the measures of the Fidesz government, like introducing a flat tax as key to competitiveness, which most of the EU countries would not share. And indeed, it's important to discuss, okay, what are the right measures at national level, at EU level, to promote basically economic growth or improve the growth potential of the EU, which at the end of the day is important. The usual comment which you can hear from Orbán and his government and talking people around the government, that they more or less agree with the analysis, but they disagree on much of the solutions. I think this is definitely a fallacy, because if they mostly agree with the problem, as it is analyzed by Draghi, then they would also need to agree with much of the common solutions. But they, I mean, the Fidesz government have been very, very hostile. I think discussions would be important, but it's very, very difficult under the current circumstances.
So would you say that Hungary is promoting more a neoliberal agenda at the EU level, and at the same time, for example, rejecting the common debt financing is also close to some German economical interests?
I wouldn't stress that Orbán is particularly pressing a neoliberal agenda. What I would stress is that they use this council presidency for self-promotion. So, they say competitiveness and they promote a flat tax and, beneficial conditions for, Chinese companies, which is part of the Hungarian toolkit, as if others would not have a legitimate interest to promote their own economies in a different way, perhaps in better ways. Also on demography, they wanted to simply promote the so-called Hungarian family policy, which is very much tilted towards the upper middle class. I would even stress the white upper middle class. And it's not really a type of family policy which most countries would be happy to opt in if they really want to address demographic decline and the problems of low fertility and aging.
What about European defense? I think that is something many people are worried about with Hungary on the EU Council presidency, don't you think?
The program of the Hungarian EU presidency also mentions the defense of the European Union as an important goal. Very nice. But given Budapest's pro-Russian stance, it's rather a hypocritical issue. Hungary does not take the Russian threat seriously. We also must not forget the NATO, which, although not an EU body, but includes many EU members. And Orbán has previously attempted to delay the membership of Sweden or Finland in the NATO. This is not a good sign for a European defense policy.
Yeah, of course. Let's see what Professor László Andor had to say about it.
Yes, this is very interesting because defense has been one of the issues where Orbán in recent years has been clearly on the pro-integration side. These discussions started after the Brexit referendum in the UK, 2016, when Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker launched discussions on deeper defense cooperation. Because with Brexit, one of the two nuclear powers of the European Union were leaving the integration, and they had to reflect on how Europe would continue without the United Kingdom. And the Hungarian position has been by and large supportive of greater defense cooperation in the European Union. And I think the current war in Ukraine is just underlying how important this is, that the EU continues deeper coordination, but also capacity building, because now it's also about capacity coordination to respond to emergencies and maybe also more. Of course, this is not something that would make the NATO redundant. And in the last 2 years, 2 more EU countries also joined NATO. So I think NATO is not going to lose its relevance in terms of European security. And we would also need to see whether there's a convergence of views among the EU countries on this matter. I think everybody remembers that also Orbán tried to make it more difficult for Finland and Sweden to join NATO, while it was very clearly expressed by the government of those countries.
And we also discussed how the Council presidency could have an impact in terms of EU enlargement. The program of the Hungarian EU presidency also mentions EU enlargement, particularly in the Western Balkans, as an important goal. Again, very nice idea. But Orbán does not just want to make the EU greater, larger. And here I must mention the motto of the EU presidency of Hungary, which is a provocative phrase, make Europe great again. So Orbán primarily supports Serbia memberships, hoping to gain an authoritarian ally within the EU with this country and Alexander Vučić, so the president of Serbia.
I think we should pay tribute to the first Hungarian president in 2011, which played a major role in preparing the ground for Croatia's accession. Without the efforts of the Hungarian diplomacy, this would not have happened so fast. Mm-hmm. And I think the EU enlargement on the Western Balkans remained rightly on the agenda of the Hungarian foreign policy, more than in many other more than in other countries of the European Union. But at the same time, and that's where the problematic part comes, Orbán has been building specific relations with some of the rogue members of this Western Balkan community. And maybe it's not even President Vučić which tops this list, but the former President Gruevski. And there is a network, indeed, which is not so much about the convergence of these countries on EU norms and standards, which would facilitate an accession, but to build specific business networks which combine a business organization with maintaining a power structure for people with autocratic tendencies. So that's why I think the EU should rightly be concerned with what is the genuine agenda of Mr. Orbán vis-à-vis the Western Balkans. At the same time, at face value, I think it is very clear that it would be indeed in the interest of the entire EU that in every semester, including the Hungarian presidency, there are some real steps towards Western Balkan integration, which at some point should indeed succeed.
Our final question, we ask whether Hungary should lose its presidency, and here are the responses.
I don't know, it seems like maybe like little radical for EU, I think.
I mean, I think it's a difficult question because obviously as an official EU member, they have the right to attain this presidency. Obviously, it comes in a greater problem of, far-right tendencies in the EU in general. So I don't think the right course is exclusion. I mean, sanctions that are in place right now, I think is the better way to go, but to exclude them from the presidency and participation in democratic processes is also not the way to go.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think the UI should punish Hungary for the laws they decided, but there's no regulation about taking away the presidency. I think it should be legal as well.
It's good for me. Countries like Hungary or from the former Eastern Bloc don't understand that. There's a lot of corruption and there won't be as a good system there as there is here.
No, I would not say that because that is how our institutions work and I mean we cannot do something against that. My understanding that the rule of law is important. Now the rules of the game are such. Certainly it's important to discuss, okay, what is the status of those rules that we have? Are they so solid that we do not want to amend them? I mean, do we want them, so to say, to be constitutional part of the European Union? Or do we want to actually renegotiate them and think about them? So it can be a case where it leads us to rethink about our rules. But that change has to be democratic, so to say, right? So in that sense, if there is some sort of consensus that it is feasible to do this change and that everything goes on within the broad framework, why not?
I found it interesting that although these people who were interviewed have somehow fears or negative expectations of Hungary's current presidency of the EU Council, they believe that they should keep this right, that Hungary should keep this right. And like one of them said, the EU should play by their own rules. What do you think about this?
There are several processes against Hungary for violations of the rule of law. It is therefore understandable that many people think, why can such a country even hold the EU presidency? Can Hungary not lead the EU in a negative direction? I think the EU presidency is legally established and it should not be taken away from Hungary. However, the European Union must recognize the danger posed by Hungary. We now have a member state that, if it were still a candidate for membership, could not be admitted. Therefore, the EU should strengthen and enforce its control mechanism more rigorously.
I think this was a subject of discussion. There have been several experts who were looking into the possibility of this. I think no serious initiative came because they realized that legally it's very doubtful that the Council presidency could be cancelled. At the same time, indeed, if there is a problematic country trying to abuse this position, there are various ways to respond. For example, many EU member states downgraded the level of the representation.
We're reaching the end of this episode, but before we say goodbye, it is tradition of this podcast to leave a piece of art related to the topic that we can recommend to our audience. Beta, what is your recommendation for today's episode?
I would choose the famous Rubik's Cube, which is also the symbol of the Hungarian EU presidency because Erne Rubik, who invented the cube, is Hungarian. The Rubik's Cube is complicated to solve. There are different pieces and solutions, but it is always very colorful, just like the EU.
I love it. I love the metaphor and also this sense of it's complicated, but it's possible to solve it. There's more than just one way to find a solution, right?
We can hope it, yes.
Yeah, let's hope. Peta, thank you for this episode. Very insightful. And I hope our audience has enjoyed too.
Thank you very much for having me, Gloria. And it was a great pleasure also for me to speak about this, I think, very important issue.
This was it for today. But stay tuned and don't miss any of our episodes. This was Central Europe Explained. I am Gloria Becerril.
I was Peter Techet.
And until next time. This was CEE, Central Europe Explained, a podcast series produced by the Institute for the Danube Region and Central Europe. If you enjoyed listening to us, make sure to subscribe to the IDM podcast series on your favorite podcast platform. Additionally, you can explore our other work on our website www.idm.at. If you have any feedback or if you're interested in collaborating on a podcast episode, please do not hesitate to contact us through our social media channels at IDM Vienna or write us an email to idm@idm.at.
IDM Podcast.
Institut für den Donauraum und Mitteleuropa.
Institute for the Danube Region and Central Europe.
European perspectives.
Regional actions.
Cooperation and expertise since 1953.